Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Find a living in fisheries. The UAS Fisheries Technology Program offers online study from anywhere in Alaska, plus labs and workshops in many Alaska towns.
I can breathe, I will breathe under the water.
Is most likely a chunk.
Find your living without leaving where you are. Fisheries Technology from UAS.
If subsistence hunting, trapping, and fishing are important to you, please consider applying for one of the open seats on your Federal Subsistence Regional Advisory Council. These seats will be filled by rural Alaskans who are knowledgeable about fish and wildlife subsistence in their region. Apply by Friday, January 29th, 2016. Information at 1-800-478-1456 or email subsistence@fws.gov.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 1st of December, and I would like to welcome you to December, but also encourage you to mind the calendar as we're only 20 days away now from winter solstice. Yay. That means a little more light perhaps by the end of the month. Maybe just a little bit. Here's a look at the weather, of course, for Alaska, and a great way to do it on your own time is by heading to weather.gov/Alaska. You can call the weather info line at 800-472-0391. And for Alaska, winter has already begun, long time ago, of course, but for the rest of the nation, it is Winter Safety and Winter Weather Awareness Month, so you'll probably be getting a little more information about how to stay safe in winter, just a little extra dose of things you probably already know and probably can always hear again. Here's a look at the hazardous weather for Southeast. We have a winter storm warning around Snider that will include a substantial amount of snow, perhaps until midday tomorrow. Overnight tonight and into tomorrow morning, there's an opportunity for another foot of snow around the Snider area. You're going to get a little bit of a break through the evening hours, and then it should start to pick back up. So watch for that trend, and again, up to a foot of new snow. Lesser amounts of snow up north around Haines, but there's still an opportunity for some of that snow around the Haines Highway. Winter weather advisory for you. Here's a look at the total precipitation through Friday morning for Southeast, and you can see the brighter oranges and the reds indicating higher amounts of precipitation here. The orange locks us in around 1 to 2 inches. Again, this is through Friday morning, not all at once tonight. And then a little bit further south toward Ketchikan, Craig, and Klawock, and toward the outer coast, you're looking at amounts that could be upwards of 2 to maybe 3 inches of rainfall. Up north, probably on the order of about 1/10 to under 1 inch in most areas. That does include the capital city. And again, this is through Friday morning. If we scale it back to just Thursday morning and we look at snowfall, you can see how some of the higher terrain is really picking up that opportunity for some heavier snowfall. And that is going to include the Snider area here. In this particular output through Thursday morning, we're looking at that running from about 8 to about 12 inches. So a winter storm warning now for Snider, up to a foot of additional snowfall on top of what you already had by early afternoon. And around the Haines borough as well as the Haines Highway, you're expecting around 3 to maybe 6 or 7 inches of snow with a winter weather advisory in force. Now looking out west, we have another decent weather maker starting to shape up. You can see the spiraling action here south of the Kamchatka Peninsula. That deep area of low pressure is going to deepen even more as it heads northward toward the southern Bering Sea and the western Aleutians, probably on the order of 965 to 970 probably by late tomorrow and into Thursday. So watch for some changes there. Out ahead of that, a wealth of dry air as a weak ridge builds in across the central and eastern chain, but it's not going to be enough to slow this guy down. As this continues tracking eastward, this will be the dominant weather feature on the map as we head toward the end of the week. In the meantime, pretty cold air is flowing down across the western Capes as well as sinking into the lower and middle Yukon valleys. Several areas there across the interior today remained well below zero. As we look at the rest of the state, here's Southeast, and we already have one front banked up against the southeastern parts of Alaska. With that, a surge of moisture is lifting northward as one impulse there is adding a little bit of lift to the atmosphere. That's helping to create a pretty decent setup there for snow and slamming that moisture and lifting it right up against the mountains and higher terrain around Hyder. That's also doing a similar situation across the Haines region there and helping to set up a pretty good snowmaker for you. Lesser amounts, of course, not looking at a foot of snow like you're expected to see around Hyder. Out across the west, a lot of cloud cover across south central and the northern and western coast all the way toward Bristol Bay and the central and eastern chain, as well as Kodiak Island. But you're looking at a lot of cold air across most of the interior. Watch how that region doesn't change very much. This is relatively clear skies across the lower and middle Yukon, as well as a large part of the Susitna Valley and west of the Alaska Range, and then north toward the Brooks Range summits. And then once you get across the higher terrain there, you get into a much colder regime and some blowing and drifting snow. Not a whole lot of falling snow right now, and there were some areas of fog reported around Barrow earlier today. A 978 millibar low sitting just across the southwestern corner of Yukon. We've got a front draped right across the outer coast for most areas around the Gulf, and several impulses of low pressure rotating around that broader flow in the upper atmosphere. So another one is rotating northward. That's bringing that additional precipitation into southeast. We saw some heavy snowfall being reported around Northway and Tok earlier this afternoon on the back side of that western Canada low. Out across the northern Bering, 1001 millibar low, that's dropping slowly east and southeast and will kind of fall apart into more of a widespread disturbance or a trough. And here's the storm coming up out of the North Pacific at 970 millibars. This is going to create some pretty strong winds already. Storm warnings out across the western Aleutians. That'll continue through tomorrow. Low pressure across the central Gulf at 977 millibars will keep unsettled weather across the outer coast and an opportunity for snow around parts of south central into the Susitna and Matanuska valleys. Again, some light accumulations of snow possible there, and no warnings, watches, or advisories posted at this time. The pressure gradient will remain somewhat tight across the northern parts of Alaska. That means the wind will have an opportunity to continue to blow across the higher terrain as well as the coastal plain through Wednesday and probably into Thursday. So that means many areas along the northern and Arctic coasts and the western coasts in the Chukchi Sea will likely have some poor visibility from time to time. Now, there's no warnings or watches posted for your area. We did have some winter weather advisories at this time yesterday for the central Beaufort Seacoast, but conditions have improved enough that that's not required at this point. Out across the west, you can see the low pressure system out in the western Berings dropped to 956 millibars. That's going to keep some pretty stiff winds moving through the central and eastern chain, and on the back side of this we expect those northerlies to really kick in. As we get into Thursday, you can see the system drop southward into the North Pacific and fills in pretty quickly up to 978 millibars. So those really strong and stout winds will be somewhat short-lived, but all the while we are expecting storm force winds there out across the western chain. Meanwhile, the eastern Gulf is still looking at that same pesky system banked right up against the outer coast at 979 millibars. The front will linger there, keeping periods of rainfall intact across most of southeast. And for the higher terrain around Hyder and places in southern southeast, do expect a continued opportunity for some snow, though the heaviest to begin probably looks like tonight. Spotty areas of light snow will be possible later in the day across the Cook Inlet region as well as the western Alaska Range. There may be an opportunity for snow from Fairbanks and north and east toward Arctic Village and across the Alcan border into Old Crow. But really for most areas in the north, it's going to be the wind and clouds and probably blowing snow from the Arctic coast. Drier conditions south of the Brooks Range. There is a chance of snow to develop around the Nome region as well as the southern Seward Peninsula into Norton Sound. And southwest looks mainly dry at this point, but there could be some snow showers generally offshore. Here's a look at temperatures today. We saw most areas in the 30s and 40s for southeast, 45 as you get down toward Haida Gwaii, Sitka, and lower 40s there around Juneau and the capital city. 30s for most of Prince William Sound. Valdez a little bit colder today at 30 degrees. South Central saw temps in the 20s there from Anchorage down to Kenai, and 31 in Homer. It was in the mid-teens for the Susitna Valley, a little bit colder as you head north out of Willow toward Talkeetna. And looks like Cantwell was about 16 as well. 1 below in Fairbanks, 5 above in Eagle, 12 for Tok and areas around Northway. 3 in Fort Yukon. Looking further north, Arctic Village was 7. Anaktuvuk Pass saw 11 below, about the same there as Prudhoe Bay and Deadhorse. 10 below for Barrow, 9 below in Kaktovik, and 12 below around Wainwright today. Kotzebue Sound temperatures were in the single digits and teens. Shishmaref had 14 with Kivalina at 12. On the other side of the peninsula, 7 in Nome. 30 for Gamble and St. Lawrence Island, 10 in Grayling, about 10 below in Galena, 6 below in McGrath today, and 10 above in Bethel. With Southwest and Bristol Bay seeing temps in the 20s and 30s today. It was at or above freezing this afternoon for St. Paul and St. George. 30s to about 40 degrees around most of the Alaska Peninsula, a little bit milder there around Sandpoint at 43, and mid-30s for the central and western chain from Adak, Atka, and Shemya. Now, overnight low temperatures will stay in the 30s to about 40 degrees for southeast, south central in the 20s to about 30, Kodiak Island 36. It looks like Fairbanks is going to drop back to about 12 below tonight. Fort Yukon at 0. Many areas around the Brooks Range and north will be well below 0, anywhere from 15 to 20 below. Around Kotzebue Sound, expect temps at or even below 0. Kivalina and Kotzebue might be some of the coldest spots. Many other locations could stay above 0. Around Unalakleet and Nome, expect temps in the low teens. Southwest into the teens and single digits. Most of the YK Delta will be cold, especially along the rivers, of course. McGrath looking at 8 below. Bristol Bay anywhere from the mid to upper teens to 20 degrees around Dillingham and King Salmon. 36 for Kodiak, 30s for the Alaska Peninsula and the chain with highs tomorrow. Back in the mid to upper 30s. Southwest looking at temps in the teens and 20s. 22 around Nunivak Island, 19 in Nome, 1 below for Kivalina, 8 below in Barrow, with Fort Yukon looking at 0. Fairbanks expected to see high temperatures in the single digits, with South Central in the 20s and 30s, Kodiak Island near 40, and high temperatures in southeast also approaching that 40-degree mark, a few going past it tomorrow. On to flying weather. IFR conditions are expected across the northern and eastern parts of the Arctic coast, with blowing snow being a predominant issue there. Look for fog across some parts of the mid-Yukon Valley as well as the upper Yukon Valley. You may see some snow passing through. Parts of the western Alaska Range and some of our select passes will see IFR conditions developing throughout the daytime tomorrow, as well as the northern passes around Chilkoot and White Pass and areas around the Wrangell, St. Elias. And ahead of the frontal boundary, working through the central and eastern Aleutians, expect worsening visibility and lowered ceilings there, as well as pretty extreme turbulence at times passing through. Now, Anaktuvuk Pass and Adigan Pass both expected to see MVFR conditions throughout the day. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, we expect to see IFR developing in short order during the afternoon. As far as Rainy Pass goes, we expect to see IFR conditions developing there. And for Windy Pass for your Wednesday, Isabel Pass is expected to begin at MVFR, but IFR conditions should develop throughout the day. Mentasta Pass does see some lowered visibility and ceilings as we get into the afternoon, but it looks like it starts out at VFR. Tanita Pass, MVFR conditions expected there for most of the day. Portage Pass on the Prince William Sound side is going to be IFR, and Chilkoot and White Pass still expected to see snow and a lower deck there. IFR conditions through most of your Wednesday. The warmer air aloft is kind of spreading out a little bit more across the eastern Gulf and dropping southward. With that, we have the surface freezing line still snaking south of Nunivak Island, but north of the Pribilofs, and that keeps most of the state, of course, as it is December 1st, below freezing. Icing potential shows that the central Aleutians will see an opportunity for at least a little bit of icing, a light to isolated moderate across the central chain, generally above 4,000 feet. West of the Bering Strait, below 5,000 feet, you'll find an icing threat there, as well as parts of southern southeast. As you get in toward Hyder, of course, that threat's going to increase there, especially above 5,000 feet. There's a little more moisture there. As we look at the jet stream, the driver of all of our surface weather, you can see several pronounced dips in the jet. The dip here out across the North Pacific is what's driving that very strong storm that's developing across the North Pacific now. And the dip we see extending from the Gulf of Alaska all the way off the west coast is what's driving our current weather across the Gulf of Alaska. And we have an entrance region, the part of the jet stream that starts to speed up a little bit faster. That's helping to drive some of the wind down at the surface. And below that, you see at 9,000 feet, a northeasterly flow that picks up from about 35 knots across the northern coast and diminishes a little bit across the northern Bering. Low pressure across the Gulf at 20 to 35 knots. Stronger winds moving over the Dixon entrance here. At 3,000 feet, winds really aren't a whole lot different. 10 to 30 knots across the north. Interior winds are ranging from about 10 to 30 knots across the Yukon Valley. And we see the stream coming in from the south and southeast across the eastern Gulf at 25 to as strong as 50 knots south of Haida Gwaii. Slower winds moving off the Yukon, about 10 to 30 knots from east to west. And then we get into our much stronger flow just south of the chain from about 50 to 60 knots. Again, a lot going on in all parts of the atmosphere right now in a very active pattern. Turbulence potential will focus up north below 4,000 feet with occasional moderate possible there thanks to strong and gusty winds over the terrain. Southeast looking at some regions of chop that could reach occasional moderate below 4,000. And out across the central and western chain. Expect that area of moderate and probably isolated severe trekking eastward ahead of the front, and then certainly behind that low pressure system again that we're expecting to drop to around 956 millibars by tomorrow afternoon. That's a look at your aviation forecast. I'll be back with an update on the sea ice edge and the rest of your marine weather in just a few minutes.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jessica Cherry,
And I'm Forrest Kirst, a commercial pilot.
and today we're going to talk about an experiment we're doing using a small aircraft where we've mounted a sensor package to the aircraft to measure temperature, humidity, and pressure, as well as elevation and longitude and latitude of the airplane. And with the package, we're going to sample the local winter inversion here in Fairbanks, Alaska. And an inversion is where you have the surface atmosphere that's closest to the land is colder than the atmosphere above it, which is the opposite of normal conditions throughout the year throughout North America. Forrest, maybe you could tell us more about how a pilot experiences an inversion during the wintertime.
On the ground during our pre-flight, it's very cold out this morning. It's minus 28 centigrade, which is about minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. So doing our pre-flight, it's extremely cold, hard on the airplane, hard on the people. For flying at the colder temperatures for doing these experiments, we're somewhere between minus 20 and minus 40 degrees. So we have to dress for that temperature inside the airplane as well as when we're outside of the airplane. When we're doing our pre-flight, we have to be extremely careful not to damage the plastic parts on the outside of the airplane. Extremely careful not to touch the metal parts with our fingers because we'll get contact frostbite. And we have to be real careful just with everything because it's just so cold. We have to dress as if we're going to be outdoors the whole time, and we use the aircraft heater to make it comfortable in our clothes and so we can see out the window. When we get the airplane running and we do our takeoff roll, we have increased engine performance and increased lift because of the colder, denser air. So we get off the ground earlier and have a better climb rate. When we reach the inversion layer, quite often the windows will fog up. The airplane's performance will decrease slightly because it's warmer air, produces less lift, and it produces less power from the engine.
When an inversion is present, air doesn't move anywhere, especially it doesn't want to move up. And so the classic look there is the steam out of the power plant or automobile exhaust, any kind of wood smoke or such, will come out of a chimney and then just flatten out and not move up. And if it moves horizontally at all, it's very slow, just creeping along. When you see that kind of lack of air movement, especially when there's clear skies, the sun is maybe low on the horizon, that is an inversion day in interior Alaska.
The reason it is so cool in the far north during winter is that the incoming radiation is at such a low angle. Now, as the atmosphere begins to cool in late fall, we start to get snowfall, which causes the land surface to be white, and light colors reflect incoming radiation right back, which causes additional cooling. And it's the reason we have a persistent inversion from late fall through early spring here in Fairbanks.
To get a radiation inversion to form, you need clear or mostly clear skies. You need no wind or very little wind down at the surface. And you need to have the sun under the horizon or high noon in December such that even if the sun is up, it's so low it doesn't really feed in any energy. When those three things happen, you lose heat to space from the surface of the Earth, but you're not getting any new heat in. And you get a very cold layer of air hugging the ground, cold, dense air that just lays down in the bottom of the valley. That's the classic radiation inversion setup.
So as we do our experiment with the aircraft, we're going to use a similar instrumentation package as is mounted on the standard weather balloons. We're going to measure temperature profiles, relative humidity, and pressure. And we're also going to tie the sensor package into a GPS unit, a global positioning system unit, so we know where the aircraft is located relative to the topography. So now I want to tell you about the instrument package that we're using on the aircraft. First of all, we use a NiCad 12-volt battery to power the data logger and the instruments. The data logger records the output from the meteorological sensors, which here include a temperature and relative humidity sensor, and a pressure transmitter, which works like a barometer to measure atmospheric pressure. This particular one is going to plug into the static port in the aircraft, which also helps power some of the aircraft instruments. Finally, we have the Global Positioning System computer, which measures the latitude, longitude, and altitude of the aircraft. This one has an accuracy of about 10 meters, which is perfectly fine for what we're trying to do here. Here's a picture of our temperature and relative humidity sensor installed on the aircraft. So this is an FAA approved plate here mounted to the window. And we want the temperature sensor mounted towards the aft of the aircraft so we don't get air rushing in and it has a chance to equilibrate to the environmental conditions. And then finally, our pressure sensor is connected to this static port in the airplane, which again just measures the ambient pressure of the atmosphere where it hits this little hole in the plane. That's piped back into our pressure sensor inside. So one of the things that we're going to go out and do today is that we're going to attach the sensor package to the aircraft, and then Forrest is going to take off from Fairbanks International.
To get repeatability for the data, we flew in and out of Fairbanks International, Nenana Airport, Ladd Army Airfield, and Eielson Airfield. So we do a very slow climb up through the inversion layer, climbing at about 100 feet per minute. Just very slow climb to the top of the inversion, find out where the ceiling is, and then once we're at the ceiling of the inversion, we do very slow porpoising up and down through the inversion to see if it's stable, if it's got different characteristics throughout it. Then we get to the next airport and we do a very slow descent into the airport at about 100 feet per minute, all the way to the ground.
There's Eric Stevens, always showing up on the Alaska Weather Show. It's amazing how he does that. One of these days he's going to do the weather, I promise. Here's a look up north, and you can see the ice pack up across the Beaufort and the Chukchi Sea. The areas in white are the higher concentrations of ice, above 80%, and then the blue shades, again, are less than 80%. We've got shorefast ice painted in here as well, and a lot of that now starting to show up around Kotzebue and around the northern coast of the Seward Peninsula, and even more so inside of Norton Sound, and as you get down toward the western coast of the YK Delta, and more to come there, of course, for Southwest as well. The one thing we need to have happen is for the winds to slow down a little bit. Once that happens, a lot more of this is going to freeze up very quickly north of the Bering Strait. So watch for changes when the winds slow down. For Southeast, we're going to have some blustery weather moving through the southern parts of the inner channels there, 35 knots with a 7-foot sea tomorrow. On the outer coast, not a mistake, there's a chance for some thunderstorms up and down the outer coast tomorrow. Isolated up north, a little bit more widely scattered down south. Winds blowing offshore at 40 knots with 17-foot seas there. The threat for storms diminishes a little bit more on Thursday. Look for 25-knot winds there outside of Craig and Klawock, with a southeast wind at 25 to 14-foot seas are possible there. Look for northerlies to develop around the Lynn Canal and somewhere southward toward the Stevens Passage region as well. Northerlies there, 20 knots with a 4-foot sea. Southeasterlies outside of Cross Sound, and from Gustavus northward, you're looking at about 25 to 35 with 12 to 13-foot seas on Thursday. For South Central, a north and easterly flow gently blowing down Cook Inlet at 10 to 15. 4 to 5-foot seas there on the inside, 7 to 8-foot seas in the north and western Gulf. Easterlies inside of Prince William Sound with a 20-knot wind and a 3-foot sea. Look for northeasterlies to diminish to 10 knots on Thursday. East and northeast winds across the north and western Gulf. And then 10 knots becoming more variable east of Kodiak Island and inside of Shelikof Strait as well. Look for winds to diminish inside of Cook Inlet and seas to drop to about 2 to 3 feet on Thursday. For the Alaska Peninsula, northerlies inside of Bristol Bay, 15 knots there. Northwesterlies crossing the southern parts of the Alaska Peninsula at 25 to 30. 11-foot seas there with some higher gusts on the leeward side there thanks to that gap flow. Look for northerlies south and west of Kodiak Island to diminish as well as you get into Thursday, 20 to 15 knots there by Thursday afternoon, and northeasterlies developing inside of Bristol Bay, dropping to about 15 knots with a 3-foot sea. Across the Aleutians, stronger winds across the west, and storm warnings will continue for Wednesday with a south and southeasterly wind, 23-foot seas from Kiska to Attu on a 50-knot wind. Higher gusts, of course, on the northern edge of that. Look for southeasterlies crossing a large chunk of central and eastern parts of the chain with a northwesterly flow south of Unalaska and Nikolsky with an 8-foot sea there. By Thursday, things are changing and improving out in the west. Winds diminish to 40 knots from Kiska to Attu, but they're not silent just yet. Look for a west and southwesterly flow across the central chain. Northerlies north of Adak and Atka, and again, a lot of change as two weather systems are not really that far apart. Gusts will still be possible across the central and western chain for Thursday. For the west coast, northeasterly winds from St. Lawrence Island down toward Nunivak Island, 25 knots there with 5 to 7-foot seas. Northwesterlies around St. Matthew and westerlies up to 15 around St. Paul and St. George with a 7-foot sea. Watch for freezing spray toward the Bering Strait. That threat continues on Thursday with northeasterly winds blowing at 15 to 25 across the west coast, and northerlies pick up around St. Matthew to 30 knots with a 13-foot sea. For the north coast, look for northeasterlies for most of the area with the strongest winds west of Cape Lisburn and Point Hope. Northeasterlies outside of Kotzebue Sound as well at 35 knots with a 10-foot sea. Watch for winds to diminish across the west just a little bit on Thursday. Otherwise, 15 to 20 knots across areas from Barrow to Kaktovik over the ice, and northeasterlies from 25 to 40 from Point Lay to Cape Lisburn for Thursday afternoon. Recapping tonight's weather, heavy snow is possible around the Hyder area, up to a foot of new snow as we head through the evening and overnight areas. Winter storm warnings posted for your region, and we're watching for snow to develop and increase across the Haines region as we head through tonight and tomorrow. A winter weather advisory is posted for you. That does include the highway as well. Watch for snow to develop around south central into the early morning hours, and that should pass through fairly quickly, but some light amounts of snow possible in the Matanuska, Susitna, and the Anchorage Bowl areas. Otherwise, blowing snow continues up north with storm force winds across the western Aleutians as we head through Wednesday. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather. See you tomorrow.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
If subsistence hunting, trapping, and fishing are important to you, please consider applying for one of the open seats on your Federal Subsistence Regional Advisory Council. These seats will be filled by rural Alaskans who are knowledgeable about fish and wildlife subsistence in their region.